So I'm Jez Taylor and I run the market garden here at Daylesford, and I've been asked to talk about organic slug control. We find ourselves inside polytunnel number 6, which is a mixed polythene tunnel, currently in the end of March, down to winter salads, anemones, coriander, and it's in the last few weeks of its growth cycle, and then we'll put the tunnel down to tomatoes for the summer. Currently it's quite a warm day, so we can't actually find any slugs, but because slugs, they like wet, warm conditions. So slugs essentially become a problem, especially with young tender crops, when conditions are wet and when they're warm. So when temperatures get into double figures during the day, it tends to be April through to May, that is when slugs are the biggest problem to growers, because that's when growers are planting out young crops. So if you're planting out young crops from transplant and they're not very big, or you're sowing seeds of things like carrots and swede and radish, what have you, lettuce, and you have consistently wet conditions during the early stages of crop growth, that's when slugs can be a real problem. Slugs live in damp shade, so you must just always assume, worst case scenario, that wherever you have damp shade, you've got slugs living and they're hiding. They're generally not out and about in the day unless it's been raining or it is raining and it's warm. But you must always assume that between the wood and the soil in a raised bed, underneath flagstones and stones in your garden, around your patio, underneath thick vegetation, even in thick grassy turf in your lawn, there will be slugs. And the problem is, for a lot of gardeners at home, is that they have lots of areas of wet shade, and even if they have quite a south facing garden, in the spring you've got a lot of moisture in the soil, and there'll still be a lot of dewy effect at night, which will leave a layer of moisture over everything in the garden, which will create conditions so that slugs can travel, and they can travel from the wet shade to attack the crops you're concerned about. Now, in growers in farming large scale situations, they don't worry about wet shade so much, because they have large areas which they can cultivate and create nice crumbly friable soil that quickly dries out. So when you cultivate ground in a field scale, you create a barrier and stop the slug travelling across that dusty surface. If that's wet, it will kind of just make its way across the top of that surface. So compacted wet surfaces, like you can see this pathway here, that's compacted and it holds the moisture. The slug can easily travel across that, but be reluctant to travel across the dry, crumbly edges. And this crumbly surface, which dries out quickly, is the reason why people talk about using salt or coffee grounds to act as a barrier to slug traffic. But the reality is, well-worked friable soil is just as good a barrier. You just have to have enough of it around your crop to act as a barrier to the slug travelling from its area of wet shade. And when you have a surface like that, which you can create by hoeing between your crops, then as soon as the sun comes out, any moisture that's in that surface will disappear in about 10 minutes, and you immediately stop the slug from travelling to your crop. Slugs don't really like to be out in the middle of the day because they get stuck at the point where the crop is, and they've just literally got to kind of stop what they're doing and hide from the sun, otherwise they'll just dry out, which is obviously what I'm always fantasizing about. At the beginning of the life of each crop, that is your really slug vulnerable stage of growth for that crop. And if you're sowing carrots in May, for example, and it goes wet for 3 weeks, your carrots will germinate and the ground will be wet, and so if you've got slugs in that field, they will just turn up and just decimate a crop. I've seen it happen. One solution is to bury your slugs, and that is by ploughing, but not everyone wants to plough. Another solution would be to stall your drilling of carrots to a later date in the season. So if you stall your drilling of carrots till say early June, then you've got generally on average drier conditions, so you're less vulnerable to slugs. Also, if you leave your plantings and sowings later, then it's warmer and crops grow away faster. If they're growing away faster, if they have a little bit of slug damage to them, they can probably take it, and the slugs are less active when it's hotter. When you're growing crops from transplant, like brassicas or something like courgettes or squash, you could plant a small transplant which has say got 50 square centimetres of leaf surface area, and if a slug can eat 10 centimetres of leaf surface area a day, then it wouldn't take very long, given wet conditions, for that plant to be pretty much ruined. But if you grow a bigger transplant, something that might have a leaf surface area of 200 centimetres, which is totally kind of acceptable for the home gardener if you're only growing small numbers of transplant, then it takes a lot more slug action to damage that plant and stop it from establishing in the ground. And once they're established, which takes often about 2-3 weeks after planting, then they tend to grow up, and the taller a plant grows, the less likely a slug is going to get onto it and damage it. But as soon as it starts eating young leafy material, then it's the kind of beginning of the end for your young transplant. It's also really important to harden off your transplant. So if when you're raising young plants you have lots of thick leaves rather than say quite soft growth, then it'll take longer for the slug to actually eat that leaf material. So if you're growing plants in a glass house or propagator, make sure the last week or so of their young life as transplants, they spend it outside before you plant them out, and they're nice and hardened off, nice thick leafy material to resist being attacked by the slugs. Mulching. Mulching's great because it suppresses weeds. It can also hold moisture, but the problem with mulch is actually creates a habitat for slugs. My early days of market gardening, big follower of permaculture, big into mulching, loved the idea, plant it in the mulch, let it do its thing. I planted all my courgettes, all 300 of them, and threw a nice thick straw mulch, and then 2 weeks later I said, where are the courgettes? And they'd all been eaten by slugs. It was quite a wet early June period, and the straw basically made sure that the slugs had somewhere to hide. It created moist shade around my crop, and that 2-week establishment period they didn't establish because they were just sitting there being nibbled away at. So be very careful using mulch if conditions are wet, and particularly on those quite succulent crops, cucurbits, courgettes, squash and cucumbers being really vulnerable. Even in a polytunnel, our cucumbers are really vulnerable to slugs, so we make a real effort to kind of keep the soil loose around them. And in that situation, I have actually resorted to using ferrous phosphate slug pellets, because I had a number of years where I would lose up to a third of my young cucumbers after planting, simply because it was cool during May, and it meant that the cucumbers didn't grow away. They just sat not kind of developing thick material, not climbing up the strings, and the slugs had their field day. We used to do a lot of like physically removing slugs, and sometimes when you come into polytunnels you will see slugs climbing up the curtains at the side of the polytunnels, and we'd actually physically remove them. I still do. It's not really pleasant what I do with them, but we don't have to talk about that. Some people talk about feeding slugs to birds, but whenever I fed slugs to chickens, they just seem to roll them in the dirt. They don't really eat them so much. So I haven't worked out how to make the most of slug nutrition. That would be a good thing. So to summarise, if slugs are a real problem in your growing scenario, then consider sowing later, because then you will avoid that wetter, cooler part of the growing season, which is what slugs love. Consider growing large transplants so that your plant is less likely to be fatally damaged during an early grazing when it's transplanted. You can always consider areas of wet shade. So that might be from where there's thick vegetation, it might be from where there's plastic mulch, where there's wood chip mulch or flagstones, just the edge of buildings. And if you really are struggling with slugs year on year, then do check out those lists of crops which generally don't get attacked by slugs, particularly things like alliums. Alliums, because of the nature of the way they kind of grow upright, so they kind of have lots of air around them. They don't really create shade to harbour slugs. Alliums are always good, and perennial vegetables actually are very good because they tend to grow out of the ground before slugs become very active. So they tend to grow in the early months like March and early April rather than in May when slugs are at their most active. So things like sea kale, rhubarb, perennial herbs like chives, sorrel, thyme, lemon balm, mint, those are all great because they grow early before slugs are a problem. I hope that's been useful. Good luck.